The engine of the 1994 Chevrolet Silverado didn't hum, it rattled with the rhythmic, metallic protest of a machine pushed 10 years past its retirement age. Arthur Penhaligon pulled the truck into the pristine, manicured parking lot of the regional bank, his rusted fender looking like a jagged scar against the sea of polished German sedans. As he stepped out, his boots, caked in the dry, red dust of his family's dying ranch, left a trail of grit on the pristine asphalt. He walked toward the glass-fronted entrance with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had spent 40 years counting on the sky for rain and the ground for mercy. Inside, the air conditioning was aggressive, smelling of expensive cologne and artificial lilies. Behind a desk of polished mahogany sat Marcus Thorne, a loan officer whose suit probably cost more than Arthur's entire fleet of farm equipment. Thorne didn't look up immediately. He finished a call, laughed at some unseen joke, and then looked over his spectacles at Arthur with a look of practiced, dismissive pity. He didn't offer a seat. He didn't offer a handshake. He simply pointed at the stack of foreclosure notices spread across his desk like a death warrant for the Penhaligon legacy. "Arthur," Thorne said, his voice dripping with condescending patience. "We've been over this. The ranch is insolvent. The bank isn't a charity. That rusted relic you drive isn't collateral, it's an insult to the balance sheet. You're holding on to a ghost, and the bank is tired of hauntings." Arthur stood still. He felt the weight of his father's eyes in the portrait he'd seen in the hallway, eyes that had stared down droughts, blizzards, and the Great Depression. He wasn't there for a loan extension. He was there because the law demanded a final, formal audience before the sheriff arrived to lock the gates. He reached into his worn canvas jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, the edges frayed and yellowed by decades of storage. "I'm not here for a loan, Marcus," Arthur replied, his voice raspy but steady, cutting through the silence of the plush office. "I'm here to settle the debt. And I think it's time you looked at the geography of what you're actually taking." Thorne sighed, checking his watch, clearly annoyed by the theatrics of a desperate farmer. He motioned for the envelope. "If this is another survey map or a tax dispute, we've already litigated it. The land is dead, Arthur. The soil is too thin to farm, and the timber was logged out before I was born." Arthur placed the document on the desk. "It's not about the soil, Marcus. It's about what's beneath the silence." The story of the Penhaligon Ranch was a story of two different worlds colliding. On one side, you had the corporate machine, the bank, the developers, and men like Thorne who viewed the world as a spreadsheet, where a 1994 pickup truck was a sign of failure and a piece of land was only worth the crops it could yield. On the other side was Arthur, the embodiment of a dying tradition, a man who saw the land as a living, breathing entity. The contrast wasn't just economic, it was philosophical. The bank saw a liability, Arthur held a secret that would turn their calculation of worthless into the most expensive mistake in the bank's history. As Thorne opened the envelope, he expected a frantic plea for more time or a poorly drafted deed. Instead, he found a mineral rights lease, hand-drafted in 1952, containing a clause so specific, so restrictive, and so utterly damning that the color began to drain from his face. The laughter he had shared on the phone minutes earlier was gone, replaced by the frantic, shifting eyes of a man who realized he had just walked into a trap. Arthur hadn't come to beg, he had come to trigger a legal chain reaction that would strip the bank of its power, its pride, and eventually, its hold on the valley. The courtroom battle that followed wasn't just about a farm, it was about the fundamental arrogance of those who think they own the world simply because they have the capital to map it. When the judge finally cleared his throat, the courtroom grew deathly silent. The document was an ironclad testament to the foresight of a grandfather who had never trusted the bank, even when he walked through their doors with a hat in his hand. Marcus Thorne's hands trembled as he scanned the document. It wasn't the standard boilerplate lease the bank's legal team usually pushed through. It was a handwritten addendum, witnessed by a notary long dead and filed in a county clerk's office that had burned down in a brushfire in the 70s. Yet, here was the original, preserved in a fireproof casing. Thorne's eyes darted across the legalese, his mind struggling to compute the implications. The clause was simple, but its reach was absolute. any party holding the deed to the surface land was legally obligated to honor a perpetual secondary interest held by the descendants of the original signatory, regardless of current ownership status, should any extraction, mineral, liquid, or gas, ever be pursued. Arthur watched him, his face a mask of stone. He knew exactly what was happening. Thorne was trying to find a loophole, a way to dismiss this as a clerical error or an unenforceable relic. But the signature at the bottom was from a man who had once been the primary benefactor of this very bank. In the 1950s, the Penhaligon family hadn't just been ranchers, they had been the silent backers of the regional expansion, a fact that had been scrubbed from the bank's modern brochures. They hadn't just owned the land, they had essentially been the bank's original creditors. "This is impossible," Thorne whispered, finally looking up. The condescension was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating fear. This would mean, if we foreclosed, we wouldn't just be taking the land. We would be inheriting a debt to you that would bankrupt our entire regional portfolio. You'd have the right to veto any development, any sale, and any extraction project. We'd be paying you for the privilege of losing money. "You called my truck a relic, Marcus," Arthur said, his voice quiet, almost mournful. "But a relic is just something that has survived long enough to prove the people who discarded it were wrong. My grandfather knew the bank would eventually try to swallow the valley. He didn't just plan for the drought, he planned for the greed." The atmosphere in the office shifted. The air conditioning didn't seem quite so refreshing anymore, it felt like a meat locker. Thorne's phone buzzed on the desk, likely a board member or a legal consultant, but he didn't reach for it. He was paralyzed by the realization that his professional career was tied to a property he had aggressively sought to liquidate. If the board found out he had attempted to foreclose on a property with a sleeping liability of this magnitude, he wouldn't just be fired, he would be the subject of a shareholder lawsuit that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Arthur stood up. He didn't gloat. He didn't threaten. He simply walked to the door, his boots thumping against the floor. "I'll see you in court on Monday, Marcus. The judge is expecting us. I suggest you bring someone who knows how to read old handwriting better than you do." As Arthur walked out to his rusted pickup, the world looked different. The dry, red dust of his ranch didn't look like poverty anymore, it looked like a wall. He had been playing a game of patience for 3 decades, waiting for the bank to make the one move that would force them to confront the truth. The irony was palpable, the bank had been waiting for the farm to fail so they could strip mine it for profit. Unaware that the very act of trying to take it would activate the kill switch buried in the legal archives. The transition from the boardroom to the public sphere was swift. Within 48 hours, the news had leaked. In a small town where everyone knows everyone's business, the story of the banker who got outsmarted by a ghost traveled faster than a prairie fire. The local community, who had watched the bank squeeze dozens of families into oblivion, suddenly found a hero in the most unlikely of places. They didn't see an old man in a broken truck, they saw a survivor who had turned the bank's favorite weapon, the law, against them. The anticipation for the court hearing grew to a fever pitch. It wasn't just about the land, it was about the power dynamic of the entire county. For years, the bank had been the undisputed king, dictating the terms of existence for everyone in the valley. Now, that king was standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down at a dusty, rusted truck, realizing that the foundation beneath his throne was made of sand. Arthur wasn't just fighting for his ranch, he was fighting for the dignity of every person the bank had ever looked down upon. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse steps were packed. It was a sea of flannel, denim, and weathered faces, men and women who had stood in that same lobby years prior, listening to the same cold, rhythmic rejection from bank officials. When Arthur arrived, he didn't pull his truck into the VIP spot. He parked at the very edge of the lot, walking the long way up the pavement. He didn't look like a conqueror. He wore his only suit, a charcoal garment that had seen more funerals than weddings, and he held his hat in his hands with a humility that felt dangerously sharp against the polished aggression of the bank's legal team. Inside, the courtroom was stifling. Marcus Thorne sat at the plaintiff's table, surrounded by 3 corporate attorneys who looked like they had been cryogenically preserved for the sole purpose of litigation. They were whispering, their expressions shifting from irritation to genuine alarm as they reviewed the documents. Arthur's counsel, a sharp, hungry young lawyer from the city who had taken the case pro bono, had filed. The bank had tried to have the hearing moved to a private arbitration, a move the judge had swiftly and publicly denied. This was going to be a spectacle, and the judge, a woman known for her disdain for corporate overreach, clearly intended to make it a lesson. When the judge took the bench, the room fell into a silence so heavy it felt tangible. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We are here today to determine the validity of a mineral rights claim on the property located at 442 Red Ridge," she stated, her voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. "The defense has provided a document that predates the bank's current ownership of the mortgage by over 60 years. Mr. Thorne, your legal team has filed a motion to dismiss based on the statute of limitations. Is that correct?" Thorne stood, his face a mask of practiced calm, though his fingers gripped the table edge so tightly his knuckles were white. "Your Honor, this is a clear attempt to cloud a standard foreclosure. The document in question is an antique, historical curiosity that has no bearing on modern commercial lending practices. To allow a property owner to hold a bank hostage based on a scribbled note from the middle of the last century would render every mortgage in this state unenforceable." The judge didn't blink. She looked at Arthur, then back to the bank's team. "A scribbled note, Mr. Thorne. My clerk tells me this note is a notarized, registered mineral easement that was never formally vacated. The bank acquired the land through a series of acquisitions, each of which included a clause assuming all prior encumbrances. Did your due diligence team miss this, or did they simply decide it was easier to gamble on the ignorance of the current occupant?" The courtroom erupted in a murmur of shock. Thorne turned a shade of pale that bordered on gray. One of his attorneys tried to stand, but the judge gestured for him to sit back down. "I haven't asked you to speak yet," she said, her voice dropping an octave. She looked down at the file, her eyes scanning the ink that had been written by a man who had long ago anticipated the exact brand of greed that now sat before her. "Mr. Arthur Penhaligon," she said, nodding for him to rise. "You claim that this document grants you a permanent, irrevocable right to veto any commercial activity on this land, including the bank's planned liquefaction of assets. Furthermore, you claim that because the bank failed to disclose this sleeping easement during the loan origination, they have violated federal transparency statutes. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Arthur replied, his voice echoing clearly. "They didn't just ignore it. They went out of their way to bury it. They bought the mineral rights from a defunct holding company, knowing full well the underlying title remained with my family. They intended to extract the gas reserves, sell the land out from under me, and leave me with nothing but a hole in the ground and a tax bill I couldn't afford. They didn't see a rancher. They saw a resource." The air in the room shifted again. The contrast between Arthur's simple, honest testimony and the bank's complex, manipulative defense was stark. It was the classic battle of the underdog against the machine, but with a twist: the underdog held the keys to the kingdom. The bank hadn't just made a mistake, they had walked into a snare that had been set by a man who had more foresight than the entire board of directors combined. The judge picked up the yellowed, plastic-shielded document with a level of care usually reserved for ancient script. She adjusted her glasses, leaning forward into the microphone so that every syllable would resonate across the crowded gallery. The bank's lead attorney stood up, his voice cracking slightly as he made one final, desperate attempt to intervene. "Your Honor, we object to the reading of this unverified text into the record. The chain of title has been broken several times over by corporate mergers, and—" "Objection overruled, counsel," the judge cut him off, her tone sharp enough to slice through the humid courtroom air. "The law does not dissolve a permanent easement just because a bank changes its corporate logo or sells its debts to a shell company in Delaware. Quiet down and listen." She cleared her throat, and the room became so still you could hear the distant rumble of a freight train miles down the valley. "I am reading from the 1952 County Deed and Mineral Allocation for Sector 12, Red Ridge," the judge began, her voice steady and clear. "Be it known to all subsequent purchasers, assigns, and corporate entities, that the surface ownership of these 4,000 acres is strictly separate from the subterranean estate. The Penhaligon family retains a perpetual, absolute, and non-extinguishable veto power over any and all commercial extraction, mining, or drilling. Furthermore, should any financial institution attempt to seize the surface land through foreclosure without executing a full, market value buyout of the underlying mineral estate, valued at the highest projected yield of the epoch, the entire mortgage contract shall be rendered null, void, and unenforceable, and the property shall revert in its entirety, free of debt, to the Penhaligon heirs. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the gallery. Marcus Thorne didn't just look pale anymore, he looked physically ill. He slumped back into his leather chair, his eyes fixed on the mahogany table as his attorneys began frantically whispering to each other, shuffling papers like men trying to rearrange deck chairs on a sinking ship. They realized, with a sudden and terrifying clarity, what Arthur's grandfather had done. He hadn't just written a restriction, he had built a legal landmine. By pushing so hard for foreclosure to seize the land for its underground gas reserves, the bank had accidentally triggered the exact clause that dissolved Arthur's debt. They had tried to steal a farm and ended up wiping out the very mortgage they were using to take it. To make matters perfectly transparent for the plaintiff, the judge continued, looking over her spectacles directly at Thorne, the recent geological survey commissioned by your own bank estimates the natural gas reserves under the Red Ridge property to be worth approximately $26 million. According to this ironclad agreement, which your acquisition team signed off on during the 1998 merger, you cannot foreclose on Mr. Penhaligon without paying him the modern equivalent of that yield first. Since you have not done so, you are in material breach of your own contract. Arthur stood perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on the wooden railing in front of him. He looked down at his worn leather boots, then up at the judge. He didn't smile. He didn't pump his fist in the air. The victory wasn't a surprise to him, it was simply the inevitable conclusion of a truth he had carried in his pocket for years. He thought of his father, who had died working this unforgiving soil, always telling him to hold on, no matter how loud the bankers barked at the gate. The bank's lead attorney stood up again, his posture completely drained of its earlier arrogance. Your Honor, we request a 24-hour recess to consult with our board of directors. We believe a settlement can be reached out of court. I'm sure you do, counsel, the judge replied with a dry, humorless smile. But this court is prepared to rule today. The bank's motion for foreclosure is denied. Furthermore, under the terms of the 1952 deed, I am declaring the current outstanding mortgage on the Penhaligon ranch completely satisfied and voided due to the plaintiff's predatory breach of title conditions. The courtroom erupted. People were cheering, slapping each other on the back, and stamping their boots against the hardwood floor. The bailiff tapped his gavel, but he didn't put much heart into it, he was smiling too. In the middle of the noise, Marcus Thorne quietly packed his expensive leather briefcase, refused to look at the cameras flashing in the gallery, and slipped out the back door like a shadow escaping the sun. The transition from the chaos of the courtroom to the quiet of the ranch was a jarring, meditative shift. By the time Arthur steered his rusted Chevy back up the long, gravel driveway that led to his farmhouse, the sunset was painting the valley in bruised purples and burnt oranges. The news had traveled faster than he could drive. As he turned off the ignition, the engine giving that final, familiar shudder, he noticed a small crowd gathered near the main barn. It wasn't the bank's repo crew. It was his neighbors, the ones who had been watching the horizon for signs of the sheriff's truck for weeks, expecting the worst. When he stepped out of the cab, they didn't ask about the money. They didn't ask about the $26 million or the gas reserves. They asked, simply, if he was still home. Arthur nodded, his face cracking into the first genuine smile anyone had seen in years. That was the real victory. It wasn't the cold, hard cash, it was the fact that the land, the soil that held the memory of his father's sweat and his grandfather's foresight, remained his. The bank, in their infinite arrogance, had assumed that everything had a price tag. They had failed to understand that for someone like Arthur, the land wasn't an asset to be liquidated, it was a sanctuary to be defended. The fallout for the bank was swift and brutal. Within a week, the regional office was under investigation by the state attorney general. The Penhaligon incident became a case study in law schools across the country, a cautionary tale about the dangers of corporate greed and the importance of thorough title research. Marcus Thorne was quietly reassigned to a desk in a back office in a city 3 states away, his reputation in the valley permanently shredded. The bank eventually made an attempt to settle for a smaller, undisclosed amount just to avoid further bad press, but Arthur didn't need the fortune to be happy. He used the legal victory to establish a land trust, ensuring that the Red Ridge Ranch could never again be used as a pawn in a financial game. Arthur's life returned to the slow, steady rhythm of the seasons. He still drove the rusted Silverado. He still wore his worn canvas jacket. But the air around the ranch felt lighter. The constant, gnawing anxiety that had defined his existence for a decade had evaporated, replaced by a quiet sense of permanence. He had proven that even in a world governed by algorithms, spreadsheets, and cold corporate mandates, there was still room for the individual. He had shown that the little man wasn't always as powerless as the giants believed, provided they had the patience to hold their ground and the wisdom to value what truly mattered. The moral of Arthur's story isn't just about outsmarting a bank. It is about the power of legacy. In a culture that obsesses over the next quarter's growth and the immediate liquidity of assets, Arthur reminded everyone that history has teeth. His grandfather, writing those words in 1952, couldn't have known exactly who would try to steal the land or when, but he knew the nature of the beast. He knew that greed is repetitive and that it eventually trips over the very things it tries to consume. Arthur's success was the result of a generational relay race. He had simply carried the baton across the finish line. As the years passed, the Penhaligon ranch became a symbol of resistance. It was a testament to the idea that some things are not for sale. The rusted truck, now a local legend, was eventually retired, parked under a shelter near the house, a monument to the day the little guy looked the giant in the eye and didn't blink. The valley continued to change, but the ranch remained, an island of peace in a rapidly shifting world. Arthur's final act was to teach the younger generation in the valley that knowledge is the ultimate weapon. He started a small foundation to help local farmers understand their property rights and legal standing, ensuring that no one else would ever be intimidated into a corner by a man in a tailored suit. He had become the mentor he never had, a guardian of the soil and the law. The story ends as it began, with a man, his land, and an unshakable resolve. The banker had laughed at a rusted pickup, failing to see the man behind the wheel. The judge had read the mineral rights, and in doing so, had written the final chapter on the bank's dominance in the valley. Arthur Penhaligon had won, not by becoming the monster he fought, but by remaining exactly who he was. In the end, the most powerful tool in the world wasn't a bank account or a legal team, it was the quiet, steady truth that some roots go deeper than any corporation can ever dig. The silence of the valley was no longer a sign of defeat, but a testament to a hard-won, beautiful, and lasting peace.